To the world, Barbara Eden was the personification of mid-century perfection, the wide-eyed, impossibly cheerful genie who could grant any wish with a blink of her eyes and a tilt of her head. For 5 seasons, America watched her inhabit a bottle, bringing magic, sunshine, and eternal youth into our living rooms. But while audiences saw a woman who seemed to live in a perpetual state of bliss, the reality behind the golden ponytail and the iconic pink costume was a harrowing landscape of profound, soul-shattering tragedy. Behind the scenes, Barbara Eden was living a life marked by unimaginable loss, quiet battles with agonizing grief, and a series of heartbreaks that would have broken anyone else. Secrets that Hollywood kept buried beneath a mountain of promotional gloss. The tragedy began with the suffocating pressure of her own success. While she was being marketed as the ultimate dream girl, her personal life was crumbling under the weight of an unhappy marriage to actor Michael Ansara. Behind the closed doors of their home, far away from the set of I Dream of Jeannie, Barbara was struggling to maintain a facade of domestic perfection. She was a mother, a wife, and a global star, and the strain of being the perfect woman in the public eye while her private life felt increasingly hollow took a devastating toll. She was often exhausted, physically depleted, and emotionally isolated, performing her cheery, bubbly scenes while privately mourning the slow disintegration of her family life. She was essentially performing the role of her life while trapped in a bottle of her own making, unable to express her true feelings without shattering the illusion that kept the network, the studio, and her fans satisfied. This internal conflict, the desperate need to be seen as light and airy while her own world felt heavy and dark, created a profound cognitive dissonance that haunted her throughout the production. The most horrific chapter of her life, however, was the profound, life-altering agony of losing her only son, Matthew Ansara. In 2001, at the age of 35, Matthew was found dead from a drug overdose, a tragedy that tore Barbara's world apart with the violence of a natural disaster. For years, she had watched her son struggle with the demons of addiction, fighting a desperate, agonizing battle to save him, to reach him, and to guide him toward a life that wasn't shadowed by the darkness of substance abuse. She was a mother who did everything in her power to heal her child, only to be left with the unbearable, lifelong sentence of mourning a future that was stolen from her. The loss wasn't just a moment of grief. It was a foundational collapse. She described the pain as a physical sensation, an emptiness that never filled, a permanent shadow cast over every joy she would ever experience again. She had to walk back into the light of the public while carrying the crushing weight of a mother's worst nightmare, forcing herself to smile for cameras while her heart was in tatters. This grief was not a private event. It was a public spectacle, as she was constantly asked to revisit the tragedy by journalists who wanted the story behind the headlines, forcing her to pick at her own fresh wounds over and over again to satisfy the public's morbid curiosity. Beyond the loss of her son, Barbara lived through the slow, painful dissolution of her dreams. She was a woman of immense talent who was consistently typecast, pigeonholed by an industry that only ever wanted to see her as the genie. She fought for decades to prove she was a dramatic actress, a woman of depth and complexity, yet Hollywood remained stubbornly committed to the idea that she was nothing more than a fantasy. This professional erasure was a quiet, grinding tragedy, a lifetime of being unseen, of having one's ambitions and growth ignored by an audience that refused to acknowledge anything beyond the character they had created. She was trapped in a box of expectations, and no matter how hard she fought, she could never truly escape the shadow of the genie. It was a career-long struggle for validation that left her feeling deeply undervalued and, in many ways, forgotten by the very industry she helped build. She often lamented that while other actresses were given the chance to grow, age, and evolve in their craft, she was forever expected to remain the static, unchanging figure of 1965, a psychological prison that restricted her artistic identity for her entire professional life. There were also the hidden battles, the moments of profound, crushing loneliness that she never dared to speak about during the show's peak. Barbara dealt with years of anxiety and the exhausting, relentless demand to remain youthful and energetic at all costs. She was a woman living in a pressurized environment where any sign of fatigue or sadness was viewed as a failure of her brand. She had to swallow her tears, ignore her own health, and silence her own needs to ensure that Jeannie magic remained untarnished. It was a life of emotional starvation, where she was loved by millions of strangers for a version of herself that was essentially a lie, while the woman behind the character was left to navigate her deepest, darkest struggles in total, chilling silence. She navigated this period with a stoic, almost mechanical determination, suppressing her own humanity to ensure the production could continue, a level of sacrifice that is rarely acknowledged in the glossy history books of classic television. The compounding tragedy was the sheer isolation she felt during these darkest moments. She was surrounded by colleagues who only interacted with the Jeannie, not the grieving, struggling woman beneath the silk costume. This forced compartmentalization meant that her internal struggles, the fear of her marriage failing, the dread of her son's addiction, and the anxiety of her professional stagnation, had to be buried under miles of hairspray and vibrant costumes. Every scene she filmed felt like a betrayal of her own reality, a performative act that required the total suppression of her own identity. This wasn't just acting, it was a grueling form of self-erasure. She had to walk off a set where she had just spent hours laughing and singing, only to step into a car and drive home to a house filled with the silence of her personal demons. The mental toll of this daily mask-wearing is something that, even decades later, she struggled to articulate, as the trauma of suppressing her true self was as significant as the individual events that caused her such pain. In the end, Barbara Eden's story is not the fairy tale that the credits led us to believe. It is a haunting, ultra-tragic portrait of a woman who was forced to be the world's sunshine while standing in the center of her own private hurricane. She survived the death of her only child, the collapse of her marriages, and the systematic erasure of her professional identity, all while maintaining a grace that most would find impossible to sustain. When we look back at those reruns now, we aren't seeing a woman having the time of her life. We are seeing a survivor, a woman who carried the weight of the world behind a smile that was, in truth, an act of sheer, breathtaking bravery. She reminds us that the brightest lights in Hollywood often hide the deepest, most devastating shadows, and that behind the magic, there's always the raw, unvarnished, and often heartbreaking truth of a human soul simply trying to find a way to breathe.